At 52, I had long since made peace with the shape of my life. It wasn't thrilling, but it was solid, like the slow hum of an old radiator on winter mornings. I was the director of operations at a small but respectable firm, where people knew my name, respected my opinions, and rarely questioned my decisions. I had worked there for over a decade. Every morning unfolded the same. Coffee in the travel mug my daughter gifted me 6 birthdays ago, NPR on the drive-in, a nod to the receptionist, and then the steady drumbeat of meetings, reports, and managerial calm. Home was a reflection of this rhythm. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for nearly 28 years. Our love had softened over time, less passion, more partnership. We shared wine on Fridays, fell asleep to crime shows, and remembered to hold hands in public sometimes. Out of habit or duty, I wasn't sure. I wouldn't say I was unhappy. I had everything I was supposed to want. But something inside me had quieted over the years, the way a violin string slowly unwinds until it hums no more. It was in the heart of one such gray morning that I first saw him. He was standing at the front desk, fresh-faced in a crisp shirt the color of late summer skies, sleeves pushed to his forearms as if even the rules of corporate dress couldn't restrain his ease. His name was Adrian. 45, I later learned. A new hire in our department, strategic partnerships. He turned as I approached, and when our eyes met, he smiled with a warmth that caught me off guard. "Hi," he said, his voice low and clear with a hint of something playful. "You must be the famous Miranda. They told me you're the one who keeps the wheels from falling off." I laughed, surprised by the way the sound came out of me, light and easy. "Is that what they're saying now? I'll have to update my LinkedIn." He chuckled. "I'm looking forward to working under your shadow." And just like that, a ripple of something stirred in me, an awareness I hadn't felt in years. I dismissed it, of course. Men like Adrian flirted with the world without trying, and women like me, well, we were mostly invisible in rooms like this. At least that's what I'd come to believe. But over the next few days he kept seeking me out. Nothing overt, just the kind of attention that felt deliberate. A question about a system I'd implemented. A compliment on a presentation. His eyes lingered longer than they should have, but always with a respect that made it impossible to call it anything but kind. Still, it did something to me. One evening, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, longer than usual. I brushed a strand of silver-streaked hair behind my ear and turned slightly, steadying the curve of my hip beneath the pale blue dress I hadn't worn in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd stopped looking at myself. Somewhere along the way, I'd become practical, functional, efficient in body and spirit. But now someone was looking at me differently. And it made me want to look at myself that way too. Daniel noticed it before I could even name it. "You've been glowing lately," he said one night as we were folding laundry together. His voice was casual, but his eyes studied me with more focus than I'd grown used to. I gave a small shrug. Maybe I'm just remembering how to feel like a woman again. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself wondering, what if this stirring inside me wasn't just about Adrian at all? What if it was a sign that something buried was finally waking up? Adrian's presence became like a song stuck in my head, soft, persistent, and strangely comforting. He wasn't intrusive, nor did he try to impress with grand gestures. It was subtler than that. The way he leaned in when I spoke as if every word mattered. The way he remembered things I'd said in passing, my preference for Earl Grey over coffee, my disdain for email chains that could have been meetings. We never crossed a line, not really. But something flickered quietly between us, delicate and unspeakable. A warmth maybe? A recognition. At times it felt like looking into a mirror that remembered who I used to be. It had been years since I'd felt desirable. Not just attractive but seen. And Adrian, whether he intended to or not, saw me. Not as a mother or a wife or a dependable executive, but as Miranda. A woman with a dry wit and a thoughtful mind. A woman with stories behind her eyes. That Thursday we stayed late finishing a project pitch that had ballooned beyond expectations. The rest of the office had emptied hours ago, and the building was cloaked in a hush that reminded me of a sleeping city. My heels clicked softly against the tile as I brought him a cup of tea. "Thanks," he said, accepting it with a grateful smile. I owe you for staying this late. I shook my head. You're doing me a favor. Gives me an excuse to avoid Thursday night spaghetti at home. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Not a fan of spaghetti? I'm not a fan of Thursdays, I replied, smirking. They feel like the leftover day of the week. Not the fresh start of Monday, not the relief of Friday. Just waiting. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then in a quieter voice he said, I know what you mean. The silence between us stretched just a second too long. I glanced out the window. The glass reflected a faint double of us, two figures in an empty office, lit only by desk lamps and the yellow haze of city lights beyond. I saw the tired lines at the corners of my eyes, the silver in my hair, and the softness in his gaze as he watched me. That was the moment I felt it click. A deep, strange ache, like coming home to a version of myself I hadn't touched in years. I stood abruptly. I should go. He didn't stop me. Just nodded once gently. Of course. Long day. Thanks again, I said, fumbling to collect my things, suddenly unmoored by the shift in air between us. Outside, the evening wind wrapped around me like a shawl. I clutched my coat tighter, but it wasn't the cold that made me tremble. Back home, the house was dark but for the amber kitchen light Daniel always left on for me. He was already in bed, the shape of him barely visible beneath the quilt. I moved through the rooms quietly, setting down my keys, hanging my coat. The familiar creak of the floorboard near the stairs. The scent of lavender detergent from the freshly washed towels still in the basket. Ordinary things. Steady things. I stood at the bathroom mirror for a long time before bed. Removed my makeup slowly, brushing fingertips over skin I had once loved with confidence. I searched my own eyes for answers. What was I doing? But the truth was I hadn't done anything. And still, something inside me had already changed. The following Monday arrived like all the others, gray sky, bitter coffee, inbox bloated with expectations. I slipped back into the rhythm that had long defined my days, reviewing financial projections, smoothing over vendor delays, making sure the right people were in the right meetings with the right slides. It was a machine, this world, and I had always been a reliable cog. But I carried something different with me now. It wasn't visible. Not in my tailored blazer or my sensible shoes. It pulsed beneath my skin, a quiet thrum of awareness. When Adrian passed my office that morning, he knocked gently on the doorframe. I glanced up, already anticipating that smile. But this time it didn't land easily. There was something tentative in it, like we were both holding a memory between us too fragile to name. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, careful not to sound too warm. He lingered. I was thinking if you have a moment later, I'd love your feedback on the Phoenix client deck. I nodded, gesturing toward the stack of papers in front of me. I'll carve out time after lunch. He hesitated, then added softly, thanks, Miranda. For everything. I couldn't bring myself to respond right away. The silence that followed felt full, ripe with implication. So I broke it the only way I knew how, with a nod and a glance back at my screen. When he left, the scent of his cologne lingered in the air like an afterthought. That afternoon, while reviewing his deck, I found myself smiling at the notes he'd added, clever turns of phrase, a bold color scheme that I would have once found too daring for our conservative clients. But now? I admired the risk. The way he seemed unafraid to let himself be seen. Later in the small conference room, he sat beside me, our chairs almost but not quite touching. As we worked through his slides, I felt him beside me like a second heartbeat. Close enough to hear his breathing change when I leaned in to explain a point. Close enough to feel the gravitational pull of his presence, like standing on the edge of a shore with the tide teasing your toes. At one point, I looked up and found him already watching me. Our eyes met. And neither of us looked away. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. But it felt like something cracked open in me, something old and brittle and long sealed shut. I cleared my throat, turning my attention back to the screen. The data visualization here might be a little dense. Try spreading it across 2 slides. Good idea, he said, his voice quieter now. Thanks. The rest of the review passed uneventfully. Professional. Polished. But when he stood to leave, he paused again at the door. Miranda, he said, his voice like a soft warning or maybe a wish. I looked up. This connection between us, he murmured, I know we're not talking about it. But I just want you to know it's real. For me. I stared at him, words dying before they could reach my lips. He didn't wait for an answer. He just walked away, closing the door behind him with a silence that felt far louder than any slam. I sat there for a long time after, the overhead light humming faintly above me. I pressed my palms flat against the table, grounding myself, needing to feel something solid. Because inside, I felt anything but. That night, Daniel poured me a glass of red wine as I chopped garlic at the counter. You seem distant, he said, not accusing, just noticing. I glanced at him. The man who had held my hand during childbirth. Who had rubbed my back through illness and loss. Who had spent years rising at dawn beside me, sharing crossword puzzles in silence. I'm just tired, I replied, managing a soft smile. And I was. But not the kind of tired that could be fixed with rest. It was the ache of rediscovery. The kind that came from realizing you'd stopped reaching for something because you forgot it was ever yours to want. The days that followed moved with the stubborn stillness of late autumn, the kind of stillness where the trees hold their breath, waiting for snow that hasn't yet come. I woke each morning before dawn, sitting in the kitchen with my tea as the first light crept over the rooftops. Daniel joined me most mornings, reading the news on his tablet, our silence companionable, though heavier now. He didn't ask again what was wrong. And I didn't offer. I think he knew. Or sensed something blooming that didn't belong in the space between us. At work, Adrian and I maintained a delicate balance. We spoke in measured tones, always within the lines, yet every exchange hummed with something unspoken. It was the restraint that made it unbearable. Every meeting, every hallway passing so ordinary on the surface and yet charged. My body began to memorize the small signals. The way my skin warmed when I heard his voice, the way my breath shallowed when I saw his name in my inbox. One evening, after another long day of containing myself, I drove home the longer way, letting the city slip by outside the window in streaks of gold and steel. I passed a florist and, without thinking, pulled over. I hadn't bought flowers for myself in years. Inside, the shop was dim and fragrant. I wandered past hydrangeas and tulips until I found a spray of delicate ranunculus in soft blush and cream. I don't know why they spoke to me, maybe it was their fragility. Or maybe it was the absurd beauty of choosing something simply because I wanted it. At home, I placed the flowers in a tall vase on the dining room table. Daniel noticed them that night over dinner. Those are new, he said. Special occasion? No, I said quietly. Just felt like it. He nodded, chewing thoughtfully, but didn't press further. I think part of him wanted to. I think part of him already knew the answer. Later, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the same one I had stood before weeks ago when all of this had just begun. I undid my hair slowly, watching the silver cascade past my shoulders, softer now, fuller. My skin glowed faintly in the low light. There were still lines, yes, but they belonged to a woman who had lived, who had given and worked and held space for everyone else for so long. And for the first time, I let myself wonder, who might I become if I allowed myself to take up space too? Behind me, Daniel passed in the hallway, brushing his teeth, humming absently to himself. And I felt it again, that quiet ache. I still loved him. That hadn't changed. But love, I was learning, wasn't always enough to silence the parts of yourself you buried for someone else's comfort. I looked into the mirror a moment longer and whispered the words I hadn't dared speak aloud. I want more. Not more chaos. Not more infidelity or drama. Just more of me. More truth. More fire. More feeling. And the reflection looking back at me didn't flinch. By the following week, I had begun to live in two separate timelines, the outward one, where I was efficient and composed, performing the choreography of my life with practiced ease, and the inner one, where my thoughts wandered into quiet, forbidden corners, where Adrian's name surfaced like a whisper I couldn't unhear. We hadn't spoken outside of work since that afternoon in the conference room. And yet, I felt him everywhere. I could sense him before I saw him, like the electricity in the air before a summer storm. I began noticing the small details, the subtle changes in the tone of his emails, the slight hesitation in his step when he passed my office. We had grown expert at the art of pretending. But underneath it, something was growing. I tried to busy myself. Took on extra assignments. Scheduled early meetings, late calls. I even suggested dinner with Daniel on a Tuesday, something spontaneous, something that used to feel romantic. We went to the old Italian place near the theater. It was dimly lit, quiet, and filled with couples whose silences mirrored our own. Daniel ordered my favorite wine before I even had a chance to speak. "You always get the Barbera," he said, smiling faintly, proud of himself. I smiled back, touched but a little sad too. Because while he remembered the wine, he hadn't noticed I hadn't been drinking red for months. It gave me headaches now. I sipped it anyway because it seemed easier. "You've been working late a lot," he said, folding his napkin carefully. I nodded. "It's year-end. Lots of prep." He nodded too, accepting it without suspicion. Or perhaps choosing not to dig. Either way, it made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm proud of you, you know," he added suddenly. "All these years. You've built something real." The words caught me off guard. It wasn't like Daniel to be sentimental, especially not mid-meal. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft. And I meant it. I had built something. A career. A family. A life of structure and integrity. But it struck me, sitting there in the gentle candlelight, that somewhere along the way, I had also built a cage. And I wasn't sure how to say that without shattering everything we'd worked for. After dinner, we drove home in silence, the kind that's not cold, just full of unspoken things. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the middle of a field, arms outstretched, rain falling softly against my upturned face. There was no one around, no building, no name badge, no ring on my finger, just air and breath and the feeling of being entirely mine again. When I woke, my pillow was damp with tears. The next day, Adrian approached me again, this time in the stairwell. It was early before most people had arrived. The hush of the building made every footstep echo. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if he should speak. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. He took a small step forward but kept his hands at his sides. "I'm not asking for anything," he added quickly. "I know this is complicated. I just needed to say it." The quiet between us expanded, taut and trembling. I could feel my heart racing, feel every inch of my skin respond like it was waking from a long sleep. "I think about you too," I said. My voice barely made it out. His eyes softened. And there it was again, that feeling. Like I had stepped out of a cold house into the sun. But I didn't move. And neither did he. We stood like that for a moment longer, on the edge of something vast. Then I turned slowly and walked back up the stairs, each step shaking under the weight of what I hadn't said. Of what I was still afraid to want. Because I knew the next step wouldn't just change a day or a week. It would change everything. The weekend came with rain, thin, misting drizzle that softened the world into watercolor. I spent most of Saturday in the sunroom, wrapped in a blanket, watching the garden blur behind fogged glass. The ranunculus on the dining table had begun to fade, their petals curling inward like secrets. Daniel was at his brother's for most of the day. I told him I had a report to finish, which wasn't a lie exactly. But what I needed was stillness. Space. A pause from pretending I wasn't unraveling in small, invisible ways. I read the same paragraph of a novel 4 times before closing it with a sigh. My mind kept circling back to Adrian, his voice in the stairwell, his restraint, the way he hadn't touched me. That mattered more than I could say. He hadn't tried to steal anything. He had only offered something and stepped back. And I, for all my longing, hadn't reached forward. Why then, did it still feel like I'd betrayed something? I looked at myself reflected in the rain-slick glass, my silhouette faint and blurred, as if I were both here and not. For years I had felt invisible, blending into the roles I played so well. But now I wasn't invisible anymore. I was exposed. To myself, most of all. That evening, Daniel returned just before sunset. I watched him from the window as he crossed the drive, carrying a bag of groceries, the collar of his coat turned up against the drizzle. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing him more clearly. The same way I was beginning to see myself. We cooked together in quiet sync, chopping, stirring, moving around each other with practiced ease. It was domestic, peaceful, even tender in a muted kind of way. But beneath it, a hum of distance vibrated, like a piano slightly out of tune. After dinner, I sat beside him on the couch, curling my feet under me, letting my shoulder rest against his. The television murmured some old documentary we'd half-watched before. He didn't touch my hair like he used to. I didn't rest my head in the curve of his neck. When he fell asleep, I stayed still, not moving, afraid to disturb the fragile stillness that passed for intimacy. But my mind drifted to Adrian's hands resting at his sides, the careful way he looked at me as though I were something breakable, the ache in his voice when he said he couldn't stop thinking about me. He hadn't asked for more. But the way my body had responded, my breath, my pulse, it betrayed the truth I hadn't admitted aloud. This wasn't about him. This was about me. About the woman I had forgotten I was. At midnight, I slipped quietly into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The mirror caught my gaze again, this time not with judgment, but with something close to recognition. I touched the base of my throat, where a faint flutter of warmth pulsed beneath my skin. I wasn't sure if it was desire or grief or some tangled braid of both. But it was real. And it was mine. I pressed a palm to the glass, leaned in close, and whispered the words I had never dared to say out loud, not even to myself. I want to feel alive again. And this time I didn't look away. Monday came cloaked in fog, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to find a sliver of calm before the others trickled in. The air was cool inside, humming with fluorescent light and the faint scent of floor polish. Familiar. Predictable. But I was no longer moving through this world the same way. When I reached my desk, a small envelope rested at the center of my keyboard, cream-colored, unmarked. My breath caught. For a moment, I just stared at it, afraid to touch it, as if the contents might tip something over I couldn't undo. Inside was a note, handwritten in an easy, slanted script. There's nothing I expect. Only something I feel. If you ever need to talk, not as colleagues, I'll be at the cafe on Ashwood at 6. Adrian. No signature, no flourish. Just the plainness of a man willing to be present without pushing. I held the note for a long time. Part of me wanted to crumple it, throw it away, prove to myself I was above it all. Another part, smaller and quieter, wanted to press it to my chest. Because someone had seen me. Not for what I could do, but for who I was becoming beneath the surface. The hours passed in a blur. Meetings, spreadsheets, half-heard conversations. I found myself moving through the day as if I were underwater, everything muffled, softened, slowed. At 5:30, I stood in the mirror of the women's restroom and studied myself. My lipstick was faint. I reapplied it. My blouse was wrinkled at the hem. I tucked it in tighter. I didn't know why I was doing these things, only that I wanted to arrive as someone present, not diminished. Not apologizing for existing. I told no one where I was going. The cafe on Ashwood was small, tucked beneath a row of elm trees still shedding their last gold leaves. Warm light spilled through the windows, fogging the glass slightly, and inside, people spoke in low voices over ceramic cups. I stood in the doorway for a moment, brushing rain from my coat sleeve, scanning the room. Adrian sat near the back, in a booth where the light was dim and the space felt safely apart from the rest. He looked up and saw me, and for a moment, his expression didn't shift. He didn't smile. He just looked. Like he wasn't surprised, like he'd known, somehow, that I would come. I slid into the seat across from him. My heart pounded like it hadn't in years. You came, he said softly. I nodded. I didn't think I would. I didn't expect you to. We sat for a moment in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Outside, the rain fell harder, streaking the window beside us. It felt like the whole world was being washed clean. I'm not here to confess anything, I said, my voice lower than I intended. I don't even know what this is. He didn't answer right away. Just sipped from his cup, I steady on mine. You don't have to explain yourself to me. Something in that, his ease, his patience, nearly undid me. I hadn't realized how long I'd been explaining, performing, earning my right to exist in the spaces I inhabited. With him, there was no expectation. Just presence. I haven't felt like a woman in a long time, I said. His gaze softened. You are one. So vividly, Miranda. It's the first thing I noticed about you. Not how you looked, but how alive you seemed beneath all that calm. Like something waiting to burn. I pressed my lips together hard. Emotion rose in my throat like a tide uninvited. He reached across the table, not to take my hand, but to rest his fingertips near mine, close enough to feel the warmth. I'll never ask you for anything, he said. But I want you to know I see you. I swallowed. That's the part that scares me. I know. We sat like that for a long time, saying very little, breathing the same quiet air. There was no kiss, no promise, no decision made. Just a woman and a man, sitting in a cafe on a rainy night, holding a silence that said more than words ever could. When I rose to leave, I didn't say goodbye. Neither did he. We both knew the story hadn't ended. It had only paused. And inside me, something was shifting, soft and dangerous and impossible to ignore. The morning after the cafe, the sky broke open, sunlight spilling through the windows with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to hide. Everything seemed sharp. The shape of Daniel's mug on the table. The sound of the spoon against the porcelain. The exact weight of silence between us. I sat across from him at breakfast, toast untouched, tea cooling in its cup. He looked up from the paper and met my eyes. You're somewhere else, he said simply. I didn't deny it. I didn't reach for a lie to smooth things over. Instead, I looked at him, really looked, and wondered when we'd stopped sharing the invisible language of long love. When did our glances stop meaning something? When did I begin to edit myself into someone more manageable, more palatable? I'm tired, I said, though that wasn't all of it. It wasn't even most of it. Daniel studied me, his brow creasing. You've been distant lately. I know. He waited, patient in that way he always had been. But I could feel the tension gathering, like the hush before thunder. I met with someone yesterday, I said softly. His expression didn't change. Not right away. A flicker of surprise passed across his face, followed by something quieter. Resignation, maybe? Someone from work? I nodded. Adrian. The name hung between us like a dropped glass. I expected anger. I expected accusation. But Daniel simply exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been holding his breath for months. I've noticed the way he looks at you, he said, his voice low, almost kind. And the way you've started looking at yourself. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. It's not what you think. Nothing happened. I didn't ask if it did, he replied. But something changed. That much is clear. I looked down at my hands, the tiny tremble in them giving me away. I didn't go looking for this, Daniel. I didn't want it. He nodded slowly. But it found you anyway. And in his voice I didn't hear blame. I heard grief. Not for a betrayal, but for the space that had grown between us while we weren't paying attention. We sat in silence. Not the easy kind. This one crackled with too many things left unsaid. Finally, I whispered, I don't know who I am outside of all this. Outside of being your wife, my job, the safe choices I've made. I don't know when I stopped feeling like me. Daniel's eyes shimmered and he reached across the table not to accuse but to hold my hand. It startled me, the tenderness of it. You didn't stop, he said. You just went quiet. We both did. And suddenly I saw him, not as the man who hadn't touched me in months, not as the reliable husband who left dinner dishes in the sink, but as a man who had also been quietly losing himself. In routines. In expectations. In all the ways we'd settled for comfort instead of connection. We can fix this, he said. Not with desperation, but with the slow, deliberate hope that only a long love can carry. I don't know if I want to fix it, I whispered. It was the most honest thing I'd said in years. Daniel didn't flinch. He just nodded, his eyes filling. Then maybe, he said gently, we start with finding out what you do want. And in that moment, I loved him more than I had in a long time, not because he held on to me, but because he was willing to let me go, if that's what healing would require. It's strange how truth, once spoken, refuses to go back into hiding. After that morning with Daniel, something shifted, not just between us, but inside me. It was as if the veil I had lived behind all these years had thinned, and I was seeing my life through clearer glass. Not everything broke apart. Not all at once. But nothing stayed quite the same either. We gave each other space in the gentlest way two people can. Daniel stopped asking where I was going when I stayed out later than usual. I stopped pretending I wasn't somewhere else in my mind when we sat side by side in the evening. There were no ultimatums. Just breathing room. And an agreement spoken softly between coffee sips and long silences, to be honest, even if it hurt. In that space I began to look inward. I took walks without a destination. Sat in bookstores and touched covers I'd never read. I went to a gallery on my lunch break and stood in front of a painting of a woman in red, her face turned away. I looked at her for nearly 20 minutes, thinking she could turn around. She just hasn't yet. And I began writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Little pieces at first. Fragments. Lines I scribbled into notebooks at traffic lights and while waiting for water to boil. Most of them weren't good. But they were mine. Adrian and I still saw each other at work, but something unspoken had settled between us, a quiet understanding or maybe a pause. He didn't send any more notes. I didn't find reasons to stay late. It wasn't that the connection was gone. It was that I had stopped needing it to tell me who I was. One Saturday, I found Daniel in the garden, kneeling beside the hydrangeas I always forgot to trim. His hands were muddy, sleeves pushed up, concentration furrowed across his brow. I stood in the doorway watching him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see my husband as an extension of my life. I saw a man. Someone flawed and steady and kind. Someone I had grown up alongside, and who had let me wander without reaching to pull me back. When he looked up, I smiled. I was thinking, I said slowly, maybe we could take that trip to Lisbon. The one we always said we would. He blinked. A beat passed before his expression softened. You want to? I think I do. He wiped his hands on his pants and stood, nodding slowly. Okay, he said, like someone answering a question much larger than the one asked. That night, after dinner, I read him a poem I had written. My voice shook at first, unsure. But he listened, really listened, and when I finished he didn't say a word. He just reached across the table and took my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time I realized something I hadn't understood before. You don't always have to leave to come home to yourself. Sometimes you just need to wake up inside the life you already have, peel back the layers, and find the woman who's been there all along waiting. Lisbon smelled like sea salt and roasted chestnuts. The air carried a kind of light that felt both new and ancient, curling against my skin with a gentleness I hadn't expected. Daniel and I walked through narrow streets cobbled like memory, past tiled walls that caught the sun in fragments, as if the city itself believed in beauty for beauty's sake. We didn't speak much that first afternoon. We didn't need to. Something about the silence felt shared now, not filled with avoidance but with presence. At one point we stood at the edge of a lookout. The Tagus River spread beneath us in shimmers of gold and slate. A breeze swept through and I closed my eyes. In that stillness I felt the woman I used to be, the one who buried herself beneath roles and expectation, finally exhale. She didn't disappear. She simply stepped aside. I like seeing you like this, Daniel said beside me, his voice low, quiet with wonder. Like what? Soft. Unfolded. It surprised me how much those words moved me. How I didn't flinch when he said them. For years I'd believed my strength came from control, from holding myself tightly together. But maybe real strength is the courage to let go. That night we sat on the hotel balcony wrapped in blankets, a bottle of wine between us. I wore a linen dress I had bought that afternoon on a whim. It was too low in the back, too loose at the neckline. I wore it anyway. Daniel reached for my hand, not in habit but in invitation. Do you still think about him? He asked. I didn't lie. Sometimes. He nodded. Me too. I turned to him, startled. I think about the man I used to be. The husband you once needed. I'm not sure I've been that for you in a long time. Tears prickled, but I didn't let them fall. You were everything I needed then, I said. But I needed to remember who I was too. And he reminded me. But you're the one who stayed while I figured it out. We sat in the hush that followed. And then Daniel, so steady, so still, said something that will stay with me until the end of my days. Maybe that's the truest kind of love. Being willing to hold the door open while the person you love walks through it. Even if you're not sure they'll return. And I did return. But not as the woman who left. I came back as someone fuller. Not because of Adrian, not because of Lisbon, not even because of Daniel. I came back because I had stopped shrinking to fit a life that no longer asked me who I was. And Daniel, in his quiet grace, had not only let me change, he'd changed with me. The passion between us didn't return as fire. It came back as warmth, as laughter late at night, as the brushing of fingers when no one's watching. Came back as choice, not duty. We made love again. Not to reclaim something lost, but to celebrate something found. And in the morning I stood at the mirror, brushing my hair, bare shoulders kissed by sunlight, and I saw her. Me. The woman who dares. Who feels. Who loves on her own terms. I met her eyes in the glass, and this time I smiled. She smiled back. And the light stayed.